Greetings again, everyone. This is the video lecture for the week one reading notes on transnational concepts and kind of an introduction and overview of transnationalism in general. For these video lectures, we're going to have two major components. The first is to go through each reading kind of one by one to pull out the important points for you, and then at the end I'll kind of tie them together and talk about how they're in a conversation with one another, the big points that I want you to get out of the readings for that week. So we have three readings this week: the Nye Keohane reading, the Keck and Sikkink reading, and the Della Porta reading. And they're all important for different reasons. The first two, one was in 1971, the other is in 1998. They both are kind of seminal or foundational readings when we're talking about transnationalism, and they give some good definitions of what transnational is. And then the Della Porta reading talks about the relationship between transnationalism and globalization in a nonviolent context, but I think a lot of those same lessons can be applied to what we're going to be talking about with political violence. So to start off with, in the Nye and Keohane reading, again, they were kind of not necessarily the first movers. There were some people in the 60s that had talked about transnationalism, but this reading is really the first one that got things started and the trend started in international relations. Up to that point, and still today, it's a very state-centric model. It's about states interacting with one another. How do they go to war? How do they cooperate? And there was not a disregard, but kind of a ignorance or pushing aside of these transnational organizations. Transnational organizations have been around for a long time. If you think about it, churches and religious groups are transnational organizations. They transcend national boundaries, and that's one of the biggest things to bring out of this is that, their definition of transnational: contacts, coalitions, and interactions across state boundaries that are not controlled by central foreign policy organs of governments. Right? So you've got a good definition of transnational relations there that you can use in your papers, but put simply, international is between states, and then transnational is across states. And so we're talking about these things that are taking place across state lines and not necessarily between states. So they talk about it in an economic context with businesses and corporations a lot. They also mention revolutionary movements. Communism is a transnational organization. Anarchy can be transnational. And so I also talk about trade unions and scientific networks, international air transport cartels, or air shipping corporations, and then communications activities in space. These are all things that at that point, they were not acknowledged in foreign affairs the way that they are today. And part of the reason they are respected and talked about today is because of this reading. And so they also have this important distinction between transnational interactions and transnational organizations, and organizations being just that, the organizations themselves, like the banks, like the air shipping cartels, and the scientific networks, and that kind of thing, professional associations. That's the organization. And then the transnational interactions are the interactions that those groups have with each other and the interactions they have with the state. And all of those various interactions can be dubbed transnational. And so again, they talk about it in an economic context, and how are these big businesses affecting what states decide. Again, a state can change their monetary policy, has a huge effect on a bank, and the bank can leverage the state and use lobbying to affect the state's monetary policy. And so you have this back and forth where it's not actually a state that's changing another state's behavior, it's a transnational organization that has global interests that's changing or attempting to change the state's behavior. So it's a really important, like I said, kind of foundational reading, and gives you a really good definition of transnational relations. And then we move on to the Keck and Sikkink reading, which is in 1998. The internet was in not quite its infancy, but it wasn't developed on the level that it is today. There was no MySpace quite yet. There was definitely no Facebook, none of the social media dimensions. But email and the speed of communications was much higher. Air travel was cheaper, and people were moving from place to place and talking with people in different places more than they ever were before. And they said, hey, we've been talking about transnationalism for 30 years, 25 years, but we haven't really talked about these advocacy networks and the difference between, a lot of the focus has been on these economic things, but what about these activist networks that are out there? And so they talk about the difference between, the instrumental transnational group let's see, get into my notes here. Instrumental goal, or transnational networks with instrumental goals like banks and corporations. And then those motivated by shared causal ideas like scientific associations, those with shared principles or ideas or values, and those are your transnational advocacy networks. That you're not motivated by an economic interest, you're not motivated by an epistemological interest like science, you're motivated by a shared moral value or moral idea or concept of how the world's supposed to look. And again, they look at this in terms of kind of nonviolence and kind of, you know, the anti-war movement and the anti-nuclear movement and anti-globalization a little bit. But what's important to think about is that this can apply to extremist groups as well. You know, groups that have extreme values and extreme views on what the world looks like can link up with activists and extremists in other countries, and now they have, you know, because they have these shared values, they can share resources, they can share information, and that is another focus of Keck and Sikking's reading, is that information and the exchange of information, the framing of information, that's what these advocacy networks are trying to do. They're trying to motivate other people to join their cause or to do certain things based on the message and information that they try and put out there. Another really important concept from that reading is the boomerang pattern. This is something people talk about a lot in international affairs, and it's pretty simple in the sense that if you're in state A and that state does not allow you to redress the government, to, you know, address your grievances or to change things, then what you can do, if you're in that original state, those domestic activists can activate an international or transnational network, and that can motivate people in other states to then pressure their governments, to then pressure the UN or other international organizations to then pressure the original state and get them to change something. So it's a boomerang. You're throwing out, you know, your information out there into the international realm through your transnational connections, and then hoping that somebody will pick that up and find it, and then it will come back and affect you. And so a recent example, we've been reading about in Chechnya, how they might be taking homosexuals and putting them in camps and, you know, torturing them and doing different things. Well, domestic activists in Chechnya that signaled that was going on to through their transnational networks to human rights groups, other groups like that. Now those human rights groups are writing stories, news articles, and putting blogs, posts up, and doing things on the internet and with their networks where they are to then pressure their states, their governments to change something in Chechnya, or to pressure their governments to pressure the UN to then change something in Chechnya. So that's how the boomerang pattern works, and it's a pretty important concept when we're talking about transnational. It's not used as much when you talk about political violence, because how are you going to use violence to then motivate somebody else to bring pressure on your state? But you can activate your network and get people to use violence in their home states, and that might then pressure home governments to then change something in the original state. So you have to kind of take it a step further, but it's a helpful concept, and again, a seminal concept in this field. And then finally we have the Della Porter reading, and she talks about the kind of rise of globalization and economic globalization, and then kind of the pushback with the, not anti-globalization movement, but the kind of, you know, different globalization. Instead of being motivated by neoliberal values, you know, these activists are saying we should motivate this by human rights and conceptions of morality. And that has had a huge, you know, effect on the world we live in today. They talk about the Seattle protests in 2000 and a lot of the other protests in Italy and Europe and elsewhere. And those kinds of protests are still going on. Sometimes much smaller, but they're still taking place. And so she talks about the proliferation and the growth of NGOs, which is another important thing, because the more NGOs you have out there, the more transnational kind of organizations there are, and the more transnational interactions there are going to be. So she gives a good definition of globalization, a process which embodies a transformation in the spatial organization of social relations and transactions, assessed in terms of their extension, intensity, velocity, and impact, generating transcontinental or inter-regional flows of networks and activity. And so that's a good definition of globalization moving forward. and that these worldwide social relationships, which link distinct localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring miles away and vice versa. And you can think about that in today's world, how much more present something that's taking place in Chechnya or in China or in Europe or somewhere else can affect what you're doing in your daily life in terms of your motivations and what you want to do and that kind of thing. And so this rise of globalization has led to this rise of communication, transportation, and these social relations are increasing, and that's now changing the way that the international system is kind of not necessarily organized, but how decisions are made and how things get done on that level. These transnational organizations can have a big effect. So the big points, from each of those readings we just went over, but how they all kind of tie together. And I think some of it kind of makes sense, right? The transnational, first they talk about economic stuff, then transnational, now we're talking about activists, and then transnational and globalization. And those kind of, that process, that logic is a lot of how we follow to where we get where we are. And how we look at the rise of globalization and kind of its relation to transnationalism. And that's what the first discussion question on Piazza is all about. And I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts on it. But also the definitions they provide, right? Use these definitions in your paper and to use them when they're appropriate and when they're useful, because these are seminal, foundational definitions, and they could come in handy. Again, the Nye reading, the Keck reading, you're going to have to cite that if you're talking about transnational stuff, just because they are kind of the renowned people who started talking about this, so the first movers. Even though they weren't, other people were talking about it before them, but they're the ones that got this off the ground, so to speak. De La Porta has also introduced this concept of globalization alongside the growth of transnational activism. But it's also to introduce you to some of the social movement terms we're going to talk about. So social movement organizations, SMOs as they call them, or political opportunity structures, which we're going to get to with Taro next week, which they abbreviate as POSs. And that was probably a poor choice for an abbreviation for political opportunity structures. But also resource mobilization theory, RMT, ideological framing. A lot of those concepts are kind of introduced in the De La Porta reading, so it's just to get you to warm up for next week, because we're going to take these concepts from social movements and we're going to apply those to the study of these politically violent or extremist social movements. And so there's very little in the readings this week about political violence. I mean, Nye and Keohane kind of talk about revolutionary movements, but it's just a drop in the bucket compared to where we're going to get. And next week, when we talk about social movement theory, a lot of that is nonviolent focused as well, because that's where the study of this stuff started, But the argument of this class and the argument in general, and you'll see, in the later readings that they're using some of the same concepts from social movement, but many of these processes that we're going to discuss, that we discussed this week and that we're discussing next week, are taking place in the extremist or politically violent realm as well. And so we're going to dig into these first couple of weeks and kind of tech up or get our definitions up, get our concepts going, and then dive into civil war, insurgency, and terrorism in week 3, and then foreign fighters in week 4. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was this idea, this action-reaction that's taking place, that, from every movement there's a counter-movement. De La Porta reading does a good job of, globalization and neoliberalism has led to an anti-globalization and anti-neoliberalism movement. But there's, just this weight and counterweight that if they talk about these transnational things, great things, we can affect states, we can do all these other things, but these transnational movements can also lead to the rise of ISIS, the rise of Al-Qaeda, the rise of the anti-abortion extremists or environmental extremists or animal rights activist extremists, They can happen in both places. And so, an example that I was thinking of, the internet, right? Everybody, the internet is great, access to information, speed of communication, all that stuff. But wait a second, if you know about the dark web and about what goes on the dark web, there's the rise of something great can also be coupled with something that allows for people to use it in a negative or an immoral way. And the use of social media, another example that generates and increases activism. I read this article a few years ago. It's right around the time of the Arab Spring. It was saying, oh, social media and technology changing activism. It's going to make it so much easier to be an activist and to communicate and to figure out where to go and where you need to be there. But governments are using those social media accounts to track activists and find them and put them in jail or disappear them. And it allows for greater repression. So there's this, something good is happening, but at the same time, something not so good is happening out of it too. And in the recent election, right, the social media, when you talk about the use by extremist groups like IS, Islamic State in another context, but also by white nationalists, men's rights groups, and the alt-right in the recent election, that social media can help spread information, useful information, and facts and news and that kind of stuff, but it also helps spread hate and hate rhetoric and fake news, as they call it, and that those things are counterbalanced. There's a weight and a counterweight process that's going on. So these readings, while you're reading through it, it's important to see both sides of the coin. That kind of these readings all focus on the positive or the good things that are coming out of this, but there's also a lot of negative consequences that are coming from this. And so understanding that the pendulum swings both ways, and that you can get good things and bad things to come out of the same kind of concept is important. So anyway, that's the week 1 video lecture for the first set of readings. Excuse me. So the next set, there's a lot more readings. I think there are 5, possibly 6 in the next week, and they're all social movement related. Some of them are a little longer, so it's going to take a little longer to go over them, but it'll also take a little longer to read them. So get started on those. I hope you enjoyed this week's readings, and I hope you enjoy next week's readings as well. I think they're going to be really good, and you'll find them pretty interesting. And if you have any questions, feel free to Skype me, aclayton1701, or send me an email, aclayton@american.edu. And I hope everybody has a good day, and I will see you next week.